Welcome back to another episode of APIs You Won't Hate, episode 13. Today I am here with my great friend Mike. How's it going, Mike?
Hey, Matt, I'm doing good, man. How are you?
I'm hanging in there, man. I am vaxxed to the max, and I'm ready to finally tackle all those problems I said I was going to do last year.
Hell yeah. Do you have both doses in the arm?
Both doses and post, this is going to be like week 4 post second vaccine, so...
Wow, congrats, man. I got my second dose last Wednesday, so I'm working on it.
Did you get any weird side effects or anything? Or
I noticed my Wi-Fi got better straight away.
Oh, yeah. Word, yeah.
Yeah. I had some pain in the arm on the first shot, and then the second one, weirdly, I didn't have the same pain, but like my underarm swelled up. Like the lymph node there must have been all upset with me. Yeah. So
that makes sense.
I'm fine now.
The first one didn't really affect me at all, and then the second one just I could feel where they injected it, and then I got foggy for about 2 days, and then after that, just right back. Up to normal. So you might be wondering, Phil is not here. Phil is having internet troubles because England is not as cool as America. Not really. He's just having internet troubles, and so instead of delaying this, Mike and I decided that we would tackle an interesting problem. And that problem currently is talking about Swagger versus OpenAPI. Now, Mike, I think you've probably heard of Swagger before, haven't you?
Yeah. So Swagger's that thing that you use. It's like a tool to help you design and build APIs, right? It's like kind of the cutting edge strategy, guidance, and build chain for API creation, right?
Kind of, yeah. Like back in the day, it was probably the most well-used, kind of most prominent. It was Swagger was a big one. RAML was another big one that was pretty well used. Apiary and API Blueprint were kind of the 4 big API documentation tooling, and they had a few other like bits and pieces with them too. But really, it just came down to using those 4 if you wanted to generate your API documentation that other developers, like if I made an API, I could send you the link to the Swagger documentation, and then you could use that to understand what you need to pass in a request, what you should expect back from a response, and then also you could like make requests through the documentation. It had its own little server powering it too, and it was cool. And then in 2015 or 2016, I believe, after a little bit of discussion, Swagger donated the specification to Linux Foundation, became what we now know as OpenAPI. The problem that we're running into, especially like Phil and myself on OpenAPI.tools and other projects, is that because they donated the specification but not the name, people still call OpenAPI Swagger. And a lot of us now are trying to figure out how do we move people graciously, kindly from Swagger to OpenAPI, like the naming and everything like that.
Yeah. So talk to me a bit about some of the problems that come along with people referring to it by Swagger versus OpenAPI, or with the two names coexisting. What are some of the challenges that creates?
I mean, the biggest challenge is that because OpenAPI is now its own specifications, its own living, breathing thing that developers can use, when you reference Swagger when referencing OpenAPI, you're kind of you're being disingenuous in what you're actually referencing, and that's creating a lot of confusion. It'd be like if I called, I guess if I was calling React JavaScript as all of JavaScript, like I need to write this thing in React. No, you need to write it you're writing it in JavaScript. You're just using a flavor called React.
Sure.
I think that analogy kind of works, but the big problem is it causes a lot of confusion, because while you can still write OpenAPI definitions with Swagger, you're actually not using their specification anymore. You're using the open source Linux Foundation backed specification.
So in other words, Swagger the tool still exists, right? But it is guided by the OpenAPI specification. You're implementing using OpenAPI, using Swagger, the tool, maybe, or potentially you're talking about Swagger as sort of a mile marker on the road a few years ago where Swagger was the specification, or they owned the specification. So maybe creates some confusion that, are you talking about Swagger the company? Are you talking about Swagger the spec that technically got handed off to OpenAPI? And are you maybe also talking about Swagger as it currently exists as something to help you build? Is that fair, do you think?
I think you hit the nail on the head with that mile marker analogy, because when I think about the road of OpenAPI, and Phil's going to kill me because it's cars and we're not in a Tesla, but you nailed it perfectly, because when I think about the whole roadmap of OpenAPI, the Swagger exit is 5 exits back, and we're not turning around, we're going forward, and everything in the future is now OpenAPI, 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 pushing forward. So yeah, you definitely nailed it there. Like, what we generally try and like be really gracious and forgiving when we're talking about pull requests on OpenAPI.tools. When people say Swagger, we're just like, look, Swagger's not dead, but for all intents and purposes, like, we don't want to have this labeled anything Swagger, because that just adds more and more confusion. And I think part of the problem is that when they donated the specification, Smart Bear, the parent company who owned Swagger, didn't donate the name either, so that way it couldn't properly be deprecated. And so It's one of those things where it's like, how, like, there's an OpenAPI marketing committee, and they're looking at how to get the name, but it's like, I think part of what the issue is like, no, everyone's talking about how to use the spec, how to use the tooling, how to get people to use OpenAPI, but very few people are talking about how do we get people off of the name Swagger onto OpenAPI.
Sure, yeah, and that's one of those things that's like an unspoken challenge about building things on the web as it currently exists, is that people who aren't super users, people who aren't listening to this podcast but need to build an API are probably just searching for key terms around building APIs. And because Swagger existed for so long and had mindshare for so long, it's very likely that they pop into their search engine, hey, how do I build an API, or tools for building APIs, or documentation for building APIs, and Swagger comes up. And without every page on the internet that references Swagger being updated to say, like, hey, this thing was called this, but here's the history of it, and you should now call it this, and here's where the most updated docs are, there are functionally an infinite amount of sources that are at least, at best, misleading, at worst, out of date and inaccurate, that they can stumble into. And so it's a weird thing where suddenly building tools to help developers build APIs is also a significant marketing challenge and a tooling challenge around SEO, which is not usually what you and I talk about. I don't think either of us are really experts on SEO, but suddenly the internet needs to speak a different language with regards to building APIs, and that's a real issue.
Well, it's funny you mentioned SEO, because I had to give a talk to last week at Portland PHP about Intro to OpenAPI, and I was kind of going, I was picking out the parts of the schema that are absolutely required, so that way what is the bare minimum you need to do to get going with OpenAPI. And I just Googled, or I use the Ecosia browser search engine just so it plants trees. But I just typed in like OpenAPI required, and this is what really jarred me, was out of the 10 or so links present, 6 of them were Swagger, 0 of them were OpenAPI, some of this API, and I was just like, that's where it comes to. It's like, I don't know a lot about SEO, but I feel like that is really a struggle point for developers, because I typed in OpenAPI space required and got swaggered.
Yeah.
And it's changing. I mean, the internet never forgets, obviously, but there has to be some sort of way that more people can kind of help change the result set, so that way we can push OpenAPI to the top and get people the right information. rather than allowing them. Not allowing them, but like giving them the ease of access to older information.
Sure. Yeah. The internet never forgets is a very accurate statement. I think it's also accurate to say that the internet can relearn, like it can remap its sort of neural pathways to guide you to information. One thing that comes to mind that was on a really, really large scale years ago was Microsoft's old cloud storage product for a long time was called SkyDrive, right? That was your, like, when you got your Hotmail address, you had a thing called SkyDrive, and it was like Dropbox or any of those other tools. And they had all this great branding around SkyDrive. They had some really cool logos. And I guess I should say, full disclosure, I was working at Microsoft at the time, though not on SkyDrive. And there was a big lawsuit with a news company out of the UK that sued them over trademark infringement. And they had to rename the product from SkyDrive to OneDrive. And suddenly all of the information on the internet ever that talked about SkyDrive needed to now do the same thing and point to OneDrive, or you'd go search for SkyDrive and you would be lost, or you'd think it was something misleading. It's a little easier when it's a company like Microsoft that probably controls most of the pages that talk about SkyDrive, and they can go update it and set up redirects and all that other stuff. But I'm sure there was a significant content production challenge around getting all that stuff to remap. And especially when it has to do with a lawsuit, and if you still have references to SkyDrive looking like a real product in existence, you can lose, what I'm sure is hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars. That's a real challenge. So maybe this is where I'll share the little I think I know about SEO, hopefully for smart people on the internet to come get in my mentions on Twitter and scream at me about how wrong I am. My experience has been that putting out content on the internet with the intention of getting search engines to understand what you want them to understand really has a lot to do with producing a certain flow rate of content, a certain amount of content that all sort of interlinks and points to each other and says, like, hey, this is a thing we think you should know about. This is a thing we think you should know about. And the way the search engines kind of crawl and whatever it may be tends to help out the content. So tangibly, what I'm talking about is when I was building the co-working company Simple, we had a real desire to put out content that would drive co-working operators to our site, because we build tools for co-working operators. And so what we ended up doing was building loads of landing pages on our marketing site that was simple.io / co-working tools, simple.io / invoicing for co-working, simple.io / marketing for co-working, all these various sites that were kind of just like, here's a little blurb about here's what we can do to help you here, et cetera, et cetera. And that drove our traffic up and eventually we had some pretty good SEO ranking for that kind of stuff. Interestingly, what we found our competitors were doing was putting up sites that were like, it would be like Matt's coworkingblog.com / the 10 best co-working tools online. And instead of talking about just what their product could do, they were listing off all of the products in the ecosystem and doing a comparison of every other product versus theirs. So they got every keyword from everyone's everything and just kind of made their product look better and better. And the result was that by having tons of pages on the web that pointed to our thing or their thing or whatever, by nature, they were all sort of rising. And it sounds to me like maybe one of the steps that could be taken to improve this Swagger versus OpenAPI problem is just doing something like that, and putting out content that says, like, anytime you or me or Phil or anyone in our APIs community comes across someone talking about Swagger in a way that is potentially confusing, there would be a use to hitting the reply button on that forum or whatever it is and posting a link to, I don't know, APIsYouWon'tHate.com / please no more Swagger or whatever that explains, hey, it looks like there's a reference to Swagger here. We want you to know that you should call it OpenAPI for all these reasons. Here's a list of references for why. Here's sort of the historical thing. And eventually, as the internet rebuilds its hive mind, it might start pointing to some better seeded SEO content around that. That doesn't necessarily solve the mind share problem. Humans still need to understand the right thing and kind of get there. And it's one of those things that's probably best as a community effort for something like OpenAPI, which is, open source supported and all that other thing. That's that's a step in the right direction as I see it, but I don't know if that's the entire solution. Yeah, I don't know. Just spitballing, Matt. What do you think?
No, I think you're onto something. It's a twofold problem. Obviously, one, OpenAPI is an open source backed. They are backed by the Linux Foundation, but they're an open source community. So I think it's a twofold problem. One, I think like your content idea is pretty sound, and like I don't know if we have a page on APIsyouwon'thate.com, but we could totally do that. And then anytime we see it, just hey, like gently kind of push to people like, this is not, Swagger is not really what you mean anymore. It's OpenAPI. Here's a whole list of reasons. And I think it's good to have us, the community, talking about it, because ultimately this is what drives conversation. Is prominent. Well, I hope we're prominent, but like prominent people, prominent podcasts, prominent blogs, people who carry weight in the community, like Phil, like Arnaud Laure, Ken Lane, all those, the juggernauts of our API community, doing the same kind of conversing across the web. And then also having OpenAPI kind of make a concerted push as well to perhaps even have a page on their marketing website that says like, why are we OpenAPI? Why are we not Swagger? Why should you? Why? Just a why behind it.
Yeah.
I think effectively those two things is kind of like a two-pronged approach should collectively start resetting the internet hive mind in a way that you can do it rather cheaply as well. Because open source communities, they're never flush with cash. It's definitely gonna be more of a groundswell. Crowdsourced effort, but I think when you have those two working together, along with podcasts, blogs, Twitter, all that kind of stuff through whoever you can, I think collectively will reset the hive mind. But then it's breaking habits as well, because Swagger's been around since longer than I've been a developer. So for some people, it's as natural as jQuery. Some people are always just going to reach for jQuery.
Right.
No matter what the latest and greatest JavaScript tool is. Some people, like in my world, the PHP world, Laravel may be the latest and greatest, but they're still going to just reach for what they're super comfortable with. And so it is going to be kind of uncomfortable for a little bit to relearn that Swagger, how you're using it, is not how it's being used anymore. And we need to catch people up, I guess.
Yeah. I think that the important thing that you hit on there is that it doesn't need to, but it can, and it's helpful for it to start with the, as you called them, the juggernauts, right? Like I have seen, no doubt, Phil and Arnaud and all these other people on pull requests across the web dropping in things saying like, hey, please don't refer to this as OpenAPI, and
Yeah.
the standard sort of diatribe about here's the things on their pull request, requesting changes to these sites. The challenge with that is that that's not scalable from a just Phil standpoint or just Matt standpoint or just Mike standpoint. So the scalability challenge, especially on the web scale, is helped by putting out content that is like, hey, here's the 30-second elevator pitch for why you need to make this change and why it's important. And if it's put out by someone like us, like Phil, like whoever else on the web, it then lives as this standing thing at a URL that's hopefully dependable that says like, next time someone comes across this, we're going to arm you with a great argument for this thing. And Phil can drop that on all of his pull requests going forward, and the community can start to use that. And it sort of starts to like branch out a bit like Fantasia. You're suddenly chopping the brooms in half, and they're turning into more and more cleanup efforts to get rid of this problem with Swagger. And it won't necessarily go away straight away, but having that content there is important and useful. And the more we're talking about this, the more I'm thinking you and I need to go buy a URL and put up a very simple landing page that's just like, hey, here's a paragraph about why you should do this, and we're going to keep a running list of resources below it, because that's an easy, empowering thing and something that the community can help with as well.
I think you're absolutely right on the scalability thing, because, I mean, we probably shouldn't talk on Phil when he's not here, but let's just, take it for what it is. That dude is doing more in the world in one weekend than I think I've done in like an entire year. So and I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean, he is out there riding bikes. He's out there publishing content. He's out there planting trees, running a foundation. Overall, it's incredible to watch him do the things that he does. So it's not reliable for us to ask him to also take on another responsibility, which is patrolling the internet, patrolling pull requests, and keeping a running tally of like OpenAPI versus Swagger, things like that. Just like it's not fair to ask Arnaud, it's not fair to ask Ken, it's not fair to ask Lorna Jane. It's got to be a group effort of all of us, just when we have time, when we have a few seconds of our day to kind of handle it. Like we need honestly, we need like a group, I hate to say another Slack or something, but like a Slack group where like we can invite as many of the juggernauts as possible, keep everyone in one place, because that also keeps your messaging on brand too, which is another thing that if you're just kind of like, hey, Phil, go do this. Hey, Arnaud, go do this. Hey, Lorna, please help us out here. The messaging is going to be generally the same, but everyone's going to kind of have their own little tweak to it. Whereas like if we can lock it down to one distinct message that everyone can copy and paste with a URL, OpenAPI, not swagger.com or something like that, that's available, I think, and I may just buy it.
You're staring longingly at a web page while you say this.
I have a name sheet pulled over right here.
There you go.
I think that's really kind of like one of the things. It's like we need kind of a guerrilla content creation, content management campaign that's been blessed by the OpenAPI community to kind of start making this push, because otherwise the hive mind is just going to get more and more and more entrenched in what they're already used to, which is using Swagger when they mean OpenAPI.
Yeah, truly the best time to have started something like this is yesterday. And so the sooner the better with these kinds of efforts. I think the other end to it is from an ethos standpoint, approaching it not as a rival or as something to be angry about, but like as an ally sort of thing, saying like, hey, it's your friendly neighborhood Matt Trask here, just coming in to say that it'd be super helpful if you could change this thing around, because here's 3 reasons, and like we love what you're doing, we love that you're adding to the ecosystem, as opposed to dropping in and saying like, look at this nonsense, you absolute fools, like you need to change this. That sort of thing is never good for community and for building relationships and allyships and all the things that we want to do in the community. And there's a real opportunity there, and I think everyone has seen things go the wrong way, with efforts like that, but we have a chance to make this thing work and do it in a way that can be super helpful. And I think between the synapses firing off on the podcast here without our buddy Phil, we can probably make something happen there. It's worth a shot. I've got a time to cut out of my day to make something like that happen if you do, Matt.
Well, I just bought that domain.
Well, piece of cake. Yeah. I mean, all right.
Would I not be? Would I really be a developer if I wasn't just aimlessly buying domains and collecting them in my little corner of the world?
I hang on to them like Pokemon cards.
I got a bill the other day from Namecheap. It was like $25 for domain renewals, and I was like, what just happened? Because which project did I forget about?
Yeah.
I think you're right. I mean, the other thing you bring up is the whole allyship aspect, which is like you can't just come into a pull request, guns blazing, so to speak, with like ready for a fight. Like you've really got to kind of you have to have a message that says like, look, don't even start it with look, just love what you're doing, think this project's great. If I can make one suggestion, Swagger is not really what you're going for these days. But I think, the other problem, as we've been talking about this, I think one of the reasons why people still use Swagger when in their projects, when they're talking about OpenAPI, is the SEO hits. And because they're able to, because they know Swagger is going to get them higher on a Google search or something like that. And it's one of those things where it comes back to getting OpenAPI to overtake Swagger in the SEO battle
Right.
Which then I think once that happens, you'll start seeing people kind of dropping off with Swagger because OpenAPI is going to get them more clicks, and more clicks leads to more freelance opportunities. It may lead to a better job opportunity. It may lead to a life-changing opportunity, something like that. And so I think it all comes back down to this is a glorified SEO problem that has been festering now for 5 years, and it's finally starting to come to a head. And I think once we break that, everything else has a chance of kind of happening as well. I think, and it comes back, I think the allyship, this simple little site that I'm probably going to make tonight that will hopefully kind of talk about why you should use OpenAPI and not Swagger, and passing that around to all the juggernauts of our community. I think that should start pushing us in a direction that will free us of this problem going forward.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think the time is now, Matt, and we'll play around with something and put it out into the world and see what we can do. It's a slow shift in tide that's going to have to happen with this stuff, but it's got to start somewhere. And I'm sure there's already good content out there about it, and a concentrated effort can't hurt either.
No, and I mean, and you like the slow turn is what I think about, like a lot of things. This is like an ocean liner. And you can't just turn this thing on a dime. You gotta, throw the engines into reverse, turn it all the way over. Let it do its thing. This is gonna be a slow process. Like, this is not gonna be fixed by next week. But I think even this conversation, gets it going in the right direction, because of all the API podcasts out there, I don't think anyone else is really talking about this.
Well, I'm glad we got the ball rolling here, man. Let's. Yeah, I have a feeling you and I are going to spend some time on some pull requests to make some things happen here. Tell me what else is going on in your world these days. What's been new with you since the last time we recorded?
When was the last time we recorded? Last time you and I recorded was like in February, I think.
It's been a bit, yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, man, nothing really. Just buying Legos.
You did at least one conference talk, right?
Oh, so I did. I gave 3 talks this month, which is a lot for me. I did a talk for the Google Developers Group in Memphis, which ended up being around like 250 people, which is like the biggest crowd I've ever talked to. And that was a intro to HTTP, kind of like a ABC's 1, 2, 3s of REST, which was super cool to do. Thought I was going to do it in an hour. Ended up taking me an hour and a half, but it was a lot of fun. And then otherwise just working, hanging out, trying to I see the light at the end of the tunnel of all this stuff, and I'm really hoping it's a light and not a train that's just like going to come hit us really hard. How about you?
Yeah, I've been hard at work for the past few months with some building out of things and content that I can't quite share yet, for better or worse. But probably by the next time we talk, I'll be able to shout about what I've been working on and share some of that stuff publicly with the world. Yeah, it's been a lot of content prep and content creation for my job on the assistant team. Yeah. So there'll be more to share. I just have to be quiet about it for honestly another week or two, and then we can start talking a little more. Yeah.
I also just saw your cat in the background attack your door. That's why I was laughing.
Yeah. She's here making trouble. They've been screaming on and off while we've been podcasting here. I'm trying to mute judiciously.
I see my cat's little paw like creep under the door, and I'm like, I know what happens if I let you in. This is not going to go well. So, all right. I mean, I think we have, obviously, I think we just put some steps in place. If you're listening to this podcast down the road and you have thoughts, comments, suggestions, you can tweet myself at Matthew Trask. You can tweet at APIs You Won't Hate. Mike, your Twitter is at Irreverent Mike.
That's the one, the tongue twister as always. Yeah, find us there. We're always happy to help and share and work with y'all. We're around. Phil will probably be with us next time. We have some topics in mind to chat with him when he's available. And yeah, man. I think that's That's a pretty good rant on naming and marketing from two guys who are not naming or marketing experts.
Exactly. And then also this project, this little one pager will end up being open sourced. So as I have no idea how this is going to go, but as it gets built out, I'll be tweeting out the GitHub link. So people who are better with words than me can massage the message a lot better. So look for that link as we get it going. We will drop it on all the proper channels. And other than that, man, I think we're good. And we'll catch everyone next time.
Sounds good, Matt. See you soon.